The morning Sylvie Garneau signed her name on a stranger's marriage certificate, the temperature outside Lethbridge had dropped to -23, and her younger brother was still in the ICU with a tube down his throat. She didn't cry. She'd used up her tears the night before, sitting in a hospital hallway that smelled of floor cleaner and recycled air, watching her mother press a rosary between her palms and move her lips without making a sound. Sylvie had done the math 3 times on the back of a Tim Hortons receipt. The surgery cost, the land payment overdue since October, the second notice from the bank that had arrived the same week Danny had fallen off the grain auger. The numbers never changed, no matter how many times she added them. Reid Callander was waiting in the registrar's office when she arrived. He was standing by the window with his hat in his hands, not looking at his phone, not pacing, just standing. He was taller than she'd expected from the one time she'd seen him at her father's funeral 2 years ago, broader across the shoulders, with the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty so much as contained. He turned when she came in and he didn't smile, which she appreciated. A smile would have felt like an insult. "Miss Garneau," he said. "Sylvie," she said, because if she was about to legally attach herself to this man, she wasn't going to spend the next year calling herself Miss anything. He nodded once. "Sylvie." The registrar, a small woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, looked between them with professional neutrality. She had married strangers before, you could tell. The papers were brief. The signatures took less than 2 minutes. When it was done, Sylvie looked down at her hand. No ring yet, that would come later, some plain band Reid had mentioned in passing, and felt nothing except a specific and clarifying kind of calm. The worst decision she'd ever made was already behind her. Everything else was just living with it. She'd said yes to Reid Callander's offer, for the same reason she'd agreed to take over the farm books, at 17 when her father's drinking got bad. The same reason she'd deferred her university acceptance 2 years running. Because the alternative was watching people she loved lose everything, and Sylvie Garneau had never found a way to do that and keep functioning. Reid's family had ranched the land adjoining theirs for 3 generations. His father and hers had been civil but not close, different kinds of men, different relationship with the land. After Reid's father died and Reid took over, he'd expanded quietly, buying out 2 struggling operations north of theirs. He wasn't rich the way the Calgary money was rich, but he was solvent in a way that felt permanent. When he'd come to the hospital and asked to speak with her privately in the family waiting room, she had braced herself for a condolence and gotten something else entirely. "I know the situation your family is in," he'd said without preamble. The bank called in the second note. "Danny needs surgery they're saying could be 60, maybe 70,000 out of pocket if the appeal doesn't go through. Your mother can't run the property alone." He'd paused. "I'd like to propose something that helps all of that. But I want you to understand it's a proposal, not a demand. You can say no." She'd looked at him a long time. "Why would you want this?" "I need someone who knows that land, and I need it legally consolidated before spring," he said. "And I'm not built for going out and finding someone through normal channels." He'd said the last part without embarrassment, just flatly, the way you'd state any other practical fact. She'd asked for 24 hours. He'd said to take as long as she needed. She'd called back in 18. The first morning she drove out to the Callander property. Her property now, technically, though the word felt like wearing someone else's coat. The sun was coming up flat and orange over the prairie, and the cold had that specific Alberta quality that gets into your jaw. The main house was a 2-story frame building that had been added onto in pieces over the decades, so that you could see the history of it in the roof lines. Someone had kept it maintained. The porch boards didn't give when she stepped on them. Reid was already in the barn when she arrived. She could see the light on through the gaps in the door. She stood in the kitchen and didn't know where anything was. She found the coffee eventually, a can of dark roast above the stove, and made a pot and sat at the table and waited for whatever the day was going to be. He came in at 7:15. He hung his coat and washed his hands at the sink, the same methodical way she'd later come to recognize as his, the way he always did things in the same sequence. He looked at the coffee pot and then at her and said, "You didn't have to do that. I was already up," she said. He poured himself a cup and sat across from her, and they drank coffee in silence for a while, which should have been awkward, and wasn't, quite, or it was, but it was the kind of awkward that has necessity in it. "I'll show you where everything is today," he said eventually. The feed schedule, the account books, the contacts for the vet and the farrier. Pierce Duval does our farrier work. Been doing it for 8 years, he's reliable. Dr. Fenn is the large animal vet out of Clarisholm. Okay, Sylvie said. You don't have to take on anything you don't want to, he said. But I figure you'd rather know how things work than not. She looked at him. Yes, she said. I would. He nodded and drank his coffee. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving along the eaves with that low, hollow sound that meant the temperature was still dropping. She'd been afraid, in the weeks before she'd said yes, of a particular kind of man, one who would use a situation like this as a kind of leverage, who would make her feel the debt of what he'd done in small and daily ways, who would mistake her agreement for gratitude, and her gratitude for something else. She'd seen it happen. Her mother's sister had married a man who kept score of every favor and called it love. Reid Callander did not keep score. He showed her the books without being asked and without making her feel like a student who needed to be taught. He introduced her to the hands, Clifton, who ran the morning feed rotation, and a quiet man named Tomas who did the fence repairs and never said much but always showed up. And he introduced her as his wife without any performance around it, just matter-of-factly, which was how he did most things. He did not ask her opinion and then disregard it. When she said she thought the hay inventory records were being tracked in a way that made comparison across seasons difficult, he looked at the ledger she showed him and said, "You're right. How would you fix it?" She fixed it. She called her mother every evening in the first month. Her mother was staying at the hospital in Lethbridge while Danny recovered, and the conversations were short because her mother's English got worse when she was tired, and Sylvie's French had always been slower than her thoughts. But she called. Reid never commented on the calls, never indicated they were anything other than completely normal, which they were. She noticed that, though she didn't say anything about it. The town of Maycroft was 20 minutes east on the secondary highway, small enough that everyone knew the Callander name, and curious enough about Sylvie that the first 2 times she went in for supplies, she felt the specific discomfort of being looked at sideways. The woman at the co-op feed desk, stout, with cropped gray hair, a name tag that said Bev, had looked her up and down once and then said, "You're the one Reid married in January with the flat assessment of someone cataloging information." "Sylvie Garneau," Sylvie said, and held out her hand. Bev shook it. "Your family had the quarter section north of the creek, still do," Sylvie said. Something shifted in the woman's action. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. "Good," she said, and turned back to her computer. The harder thing was the Callander family's neighbor on the east side, a man named Dwight Ford, whose family had apparently had some ongoing arrangement with the previous Callander generation about shared water access that Reid had let lapse when he took over. Dwight Ford did not like Reid, and he extended that opinion to Sylvie on principle. He came by twice in February, once to complain about a fence line, and once, she suspected, to see what kind of woman Reid had brought in. He was the type who talked past women to the men behind them, which meant he was also the type who underestimated them consistently. She let him underestimate her. It was a useful quality in a person, to be underestimated. The thing about living in proximity to someone you don't yet know is that you learn them in pieces, not in conversations. She learned Reid in the mornings, which were his most honest time, before the day's logistics took over. She learned that he read actual books, not screens, and that he kept them in a haphazard stack beside the armchair in the living room that she eventually organized and then reorganized back to his way when she realized he knew where everything was. She learned that he'd been engaged once briefly, about 6 years ago, and that he'd called it off and didn't talk about it, and she didn't ask. She learned that he drove into Lethbridge twice a month to see his aunt, a woman in her 80s named Marion, who'd helped raise him after his mother left, and that these visits were not negotiable in his calendar no matter what else was happening. She went with him once, in March. Marion Callander was small and sharp-eyed, and shook Sylvie's hand with a grip that suggested she'd once been stronger and wasn't going to apologize for being older. She looked at Sylvie for a long moment and then said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Sylvie asked. "Someone more desperate," Marion said frankly. Reid said the situation was, she paused, looking for the word, urgent. Urgent people usually look at. "I'm past urgent," Sylvie said. Urgent was January. Marion had laughed a real laugh. She'd looked at Reid and said something Sylvie didn't catch, and Reid had looked at his coffee and not smiled exactly, but something around his eyes had loosened. The surgery worked. Danny was out of the ICU by early February and in a rehabilitation facility by March, relearning how to get his left side to cooperate. He was 22 and furious about it, and calling Sylvie every other day to complain, which she took as a sign of recovery. She drove down on a Saturday in March and sat with him for 4 hours, while he did exercises that clearly bored and humiliated him, and she brought him the specific brand of ketchup chips he'd liked since he was 9. And she didn't tell him about the marriage until he asked directly. "Mom said you did something," he said. "I got married," Sylvie said. He stared at her. "To who?" "Reid Callander." The silence lasted long enough that she counted it. "The guy who bought the Halverson place." "And the Birch Creek parcel," she said. "Sylvie." He said her name the way their father used to, as if it were both a statement and a question. "It made sense," she said. "It still makes sense. Does he? Are you?" He stopped, started again. "Is he good to you?" She thought about the coffee in the morning. She thought about the ledger. She thought about the way he'd introduced her to Clifton and Tomas without making it strange. "Yes," she said, "he is." Danny looked at the bag of chips in his lap. "Okay," he said finally. The water access dispute with Dwight Ford escalated in April, which Sylvie had half predicted from the moment she'd watched him conduct his February visits. He filed a formal complaint with the rural municipality, claiming the creek diversion Reid had put in 3 years earlier was affecting his irrigation capacity. The complaint had enough technical language in it that it was clear he'd paid someone to write it, which meant he was invested. Reid's response was to pull out survey maps from 1987 and every subsequent amendment and spread them on the kitchen table and go through them with the kind of patience that was either genuine or so well practiced it amounted to the same thing. Sylvie sat across from him and read the complaint again, more carefully. "He's not wrong about the diversion affecting flow," she said. "I know," Reid said. "So why did you put it in?" "Because the lower field was waterlogged every spring and was losing cattle." He said it without defensiveness. Ford was consulted. He agreed in principle and then changed his mind when I was already committed to the work. She looked at the maps. "He has a letter?" "He says he does. I don't think it says what he thinks it says." "Can I see both?" He got them. She read them with the same attention she'd given the account books in January, making notes in the margins, and after an hour she said, "He agreed to a modification, not a reversal. The modification is what you built. His complaint is based on misreading his own letter." Reid looked at what she'd written. He was quiet for a moment. "His lawyer may not have noticed that. His lawyer may have," Sylvie said, "and is hoping yours doesn't." He looked at her. It was the look she'd gotten from him a few times before. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of something he'd suspected but hadn't yet verified. "I'll call Brendan tomorrow," he said. Brendan was his solicitor in Lethbridge. "You want to be on that call?" "Yes," she said. She was on the call. Brendan, who had clearly expected to be managing a simple property dispute, spent the first 10 minutes recalibrating to the reality that Sylvie had already done a significant portion of his work for him. He was professional enough to be grateful about it. The complaint was dismissed in June. By then the ranch had settled into a rhythm that included her in a way that felt, if not natural, then at least earned. She knew which gates latched wrong and needed to be lifted before they'd close. She knew that Clifton's wife was expecting their second child, and that Clifton worked better in the mornings and slower after lunch, which was a pattern she accommodated by front-loading anything she needed from him before noon. She knew that Tomas was saving to bring his mother up from Mexico City, and that he sent a portion of his pay home every month. And she knew this not because he'd told her, but because she'd overheard him on the phone one evening, while she was checking on the water troughs, and she had the sense to pretend she hadn't. She knew Reid, too, by then. Or she was beginning to. She knew that he woke at 5, regardless of what had happened the night before, and that this wasn't discipline so much as how he was made. She knew that he was careful with money, not from scarcity, but from a genuine belief that waste was disrespectful to the work that produced things. She knew that when something went wrong, a sick animal, a piece of equipment that failed, a week of weather that undid 3 weeks of fence repair, he went quiet, not sullen, but quiet in the way of a person who is thinking rather than reacting. She had come to prefer this to the alternative. What she hadn't anticipated was how much she would come to rely on his particular brand of stillness. She'd grown up in a house where emotion moved loudly, where her father's moods set the temperature for everything else, where her mother managed by always being slightly ahead of the next crisis. She had learned to read rooms fast and recalibrate constantly. With Reid, the room didn't need reading. He was the same in the morning as in the evening, the same when things were hard as when they weren't. It wasn't that he had no interior. She was learning, slowly, that he had a considerable one, but it didn't spill. She found this steadying in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't entirely account for. In July, her mother came to visit for a week. Sylvie had worried, vaguely, about what that would look like. Her mother was perceptive in the specific way of women who have had to be, and the arrangement between Sylvie and Reid was not the kind that bore scrutiny from someone who loved you. Her mother arrived on a Wednesday morning with a suitcase and a jar of the pickled beets she'd been making since before Sylvie was born, and she walked around the kitchen with the assessing look she gave, every space she entered. And then she sat down at the table and accepted the coffee Reid poured for her without being asked, and said thank you in the specific tone she used when she meant it. She watched Reid for 3 days before she said anything to Sylvie about him. On the Thursday evening she came and sat beside Sylvie on the porch steps while Reid was still in the barn, and she was quiet for a while in the particular way she had. "He's careful with you," her mother said eventually. "Not a question. He's careful with everything," Sylvie said. Her mother considered this. "That's not the same as what I said." Sylvie looked out at the darkening field. The light was going orange over the Porcupine Hills to the west, and the air smelled like cut grass and something mineral from the creek. She didn't answer right away. "No," she finally said, "it's not." Her mother stayed the full week. When Reid drove her to the Lethbridge bus station on Sunday morning, she shook his hand at the door and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required, and said something to him in French that Sylvie couldn't hear. Reid, who did not speak French, nodded anyway, as if he understood the intent, if not the words. In the truck on the way back, Sylvie asked him what her mother had said. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said, "but the way she said it, I think she was saying she trusted me to keep doing what I'm doing." Sylvie looked out the window at the highway running straight between fields of still green wheat. "That sounds right," she said. The thing she hadn't let herself think about, in the first months, was what any of this was. She'd been practical about it from the start, which was the only way she knew to be about things that scared her. She'd categorized it as an arrangement that benefited both of them, and tried not to look at it sideways. When Reid did something that registered as more than practical, the way he left the kitchen light on when she came in late from Lethbridge, the way he'd driven 40 minutes into town the week Danny was discharged just to pick up the particular French bread her mother had mentioned liking. She filed these things somewhere she wasn't examining yet. She examined them in August, lying awake at 1 in the morning, listening to the wind moving across the fields. She was not a person who was comfortable with not knowing what something was. She had spent 6 months telling herself that she didn't need to know, and now she was lying in the dark adding up evidence like she'd added up the numbers on that hospital receipt. And the sum was coming out different than expected. She got up. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark, not turning the light on, because the dark felt more honest, and she sat with what she was actually feeling for the first time since January. She was not afraid of Reid Callander. She had married him afraid, and she was no longer that. She trusted him, which was different from liking him, and different from the thing she was approaching now, but couldn't name without it changing. She admired him, which she'd permitted herself to think once or twice, without finding it alarming. She realized in the dark at 1 in the morning, to know what he thought about things beyond the ranch, beyond the day's logistics and the water table and the county land use bylaws. She wanted to know what he thought about the rest of the world, and whether he had opinions about it, and whether they'd be the same as hers or completely different, and whether that would matter. She was so absorbed in this accounting that she didn't hear him come down the stairs, and when the kitchen light came on, she startled badly enough to slosh tea on the table. "Sorry," Reid said. "I thought you were asleep," she said, which was ridiculous. "I was." He looked at her for a moment. "You want more tea?" "Yes," she said, because she didn't know what else to say. He put the kettle on and sat down across from her, and didn't ask what she was doing up, which was either restraint or intelligence. She suspected both. "I keep trying to figure out what this is," she said, because she had apparently decided to say it. "What we are." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd made a mistake. "I don't know," he said, "but I don't think it's what it started as." She looked at the table. "No, I think." He stopped. "Started differently. I didn't know what to expect from you. When I made the offer, I thought I was solving a practical problem." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "That's not what happened." "What happened?" she asked. "You happened," he said simply. "You showed up and you just worked. Not because you had to. Because you're you." She looked at him across the table. He was looking back at her with the same directness he brought to everything else, and she understood, in the way you understand things that have been true for a while before you let yourself see them, that what she felt was already decided. Had been for a while. She'd just been waiting for the evidence to be complete enough to trust. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay," he said. "I'm not sorry I said yes," she said. "I was for a while. In January, February. I kept telling myself I'd made a transaction, and I needed to be practical about it." She paused. "I'm not sorry anymore." He was quiet for a moment. The kettle was beginning to sound. "I'm not sorry I asked," he said. She got up to take the kettle off the burner. When she turned back around, he was still sitting there, watching her in the way she was used to from him, attentive, unhurried, like she was worth the time it took to really look. She stood with her back against the counter, and he sat with his hands around his cup, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and it wasn't empty silence at all. The Ford situation had one more chapter. In late September, Dwight Ford stopped by unannounced, the way he always had, without phoning ahead, a habit that said something about him, and this time Sylvie was the only one there, Reid having driven out to the north pasture with Clifton, to check on a section of fencing that hadn't survived the August hailstorm. Ford stood on the porch and looked at her and said, "I need to speak to Reid." "He's not here," Sylvie said. "I can help you or you can call his cell." Ford looked at her in the way he always had, as if she were an obstacle in the path to the real conversation. "It's a property matter," he said. "I'd rather deal with him directly." "I handle our property matters," Sylvie said. "If there's something new, you can tell me." He looked at her for a longer moment. She looked back without any particular expression, which was something she'd learned from Reid. "It's about the spring access," he said finally. "I want to discuss a new arrangement." She opened the door wider. "Then come in," she said. She poured coffee without being asked, and she sat down across from him, and she listened to what he wanted, which was not unreasonable now that the formal complaint had failed, and he was approaching it without a solicitor's hand shaping his words. What he wanted was winter water access through the south field in exchange for a right-of-way he'd been using informally that Reid actually needed formalized. It was, Sylvie thought, a deal that worked for both of them, and Ford had probably known it for a year and was only arriving at it now because the formal route hadn't worked. She didn't say that. She said, "Let me talk to Reid and we'll follow up this week." Ford looked at her when he was leaving. Really looked at her, for maybe the first time. "You're not what I thought you were," he said. He didn't sound displeased. "Most people aren't," she said. She called Reid while Ford was still pulling out of the drive, and she laid out the proposal, and Reid was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's a better deal than I would have thought to ask for." "He came to us," she said. "That changes the math." A brief pause on the line. "Yes," he said. "It does." The formal agreement with Ford was signed in October. The land, which had been her family's land, and then a crisis, and then an arrangement, and then something she genuinely tended, had its first good autumn accounting since before her father's drinking had made the numbers start to drift. She sent her mother a check that covered the last of the bank's second note, and she drove down to see Danny, walking with a cane in the parking lot of the rehabilitation center, practicing on the uneven pavement, swearing under his breath at each step, looking more like himself than she'd seen him since before the accident. "You look better," she told him. "I feel terrible," he said, which meant he was fine. She drove home in the early dark, the highway running out straight in her headlights, the fields on either side of her turned to stubble. She knew the road by heart now. She knew where the low spot was that flooded in May, where the deer came out of the brush in the evenings, where the cellular service dropped for a quarter mile and then came back. She knew this land. She'd come to it afraid, and she knew it now the way you know things you've worked for. The kitchen light was on when she pulled in. She sat in the truck for a moment before going in, looking at the rectangle of yellow light in the window. She thought about the woman who had stood in a registrar's office in January with nothing left to lose, and had signed her name to a stranger's document and called it survival. She wasn't that woman anymore. She wasn't sure exactly when she'd stopped being her. Sometime between the coffee and the ledger and the 1 a.m. kitchen and the sound of the wind over the eaves of a house she'd learned to call hers. Sometime between fear and here, she got out of the truck and went inside. Reid was at the stove. He'd started dinner without her, which he'd done before, and which still struck her as quietly significant, the way the small things always did. Not because they were grand, but because they added up to something she'd stopped trying not to name. "Danny's walking," she said, pulling off her coat. "Yeah?" He looked at her with that particular attention she'd been the subject of all year. "That's good news." "He's still swearing at the pavement," she said, "but that's just Danny." Reid almost smiled. "With him you learn to watch for the almost." "Sit down," he said. "It's ready." She sat down at the kitchen table, where she'd sat in January, not knowing where anything was, and she watched him move between the stove and the counter with the same steady competence he brought to everything, and she felt, under the tiredness and the relief and the weight of the year, something she hadn't felt in a long time, something quiet and located and entirely her own. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could account for, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be.